Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. So today we're going to be talking about moving beyond ChatGPT, exploring better options for grading. So I'm Anjinder, and I'm excited to have you all here today as we dive into a really critical topic that's shaping the future of education. We've got a jam-packed session today lined up for you, starting with a talk from myself describing how generative and classification AI systems are distinct and what strategies you can use when you're thinking about integrating it into your own systems. Then we've got a roundtable discussion with James Love, the Chief Product Officer at Appdem, Tim Burnett, the founder of the Test Community Network, and Pat Coates, the CEO of the E-Assessment Association. And then lastly, we'll jump into a short classification AI demo, demonstrating exactly the details that we kind of explained earlier in the conversation. So with that, let's get started. The first thing I really want to talk about is about how technology is really a wonderful thing. It can solve so many problems. So I sort of want to start with a hypothetical. Imagine that you're facing a challenge and you're considering using technology as a solution. The first thing you really have to evaluate is whether or not you're willing to accept some degree of risk. So, for example, if the stakes are low, like managing a personal to-do list or making toast, you might opt for a tool with high variability because you're able to accept any potential errors that occur because the impact of any mistake is relatively minor. However, when high-stakes tasks are involved, such as diagnosing medical conditions, the need for technology with high accuracy and explainability and reliability and minimal bias becomes paramount because the errors here can have really high consequences. Grading falls into this high-stakes category, requiring the utmost precision. Generative AI is known for its variability. Now, it might be suitable for tasks where flexibility is acceptable, but for grading, where each decision impacts a student's future, the two are fundamentally incompatible. And we need to design tools that are consistent and fair to ensure that each student is evaluated accurately. So, what is generative AI? I'm sure a lot of us have actually seen these types of tools. There are multiple types. We can create video and audio using these tools and images as well. But we're going to primarily focus on text generation because this is the primary modality for grading. Now, in its simplest form, text generation is really sort of like the world's greatest auto-predict algorithm. When you're typing on your phone and it suggests the next word that you might want to type, or you're typing your email client and it's guessing the rest of your sentence, it's effectively that, just a lot more powerful. Now, technically speaking, those systems don't use the same architecture under the hood, but effectively this is what is happening. You take all of the data that you possibly can get your hands on, you break it up into little bits, also known as tokens, and effectively you use algorithms to be able to predict the next token that's most likely based on the previous bits. That's just generative AI in a nutshell. Now, naturally, this causes problems, like I hinted at earlier. The three big problems, in my opinion, are the fact that it affects bias, it has consistency issues, and it lacks explainability. So, on the bias front, generative AI, it learns from existing data. In fact, it requires a significant amount. The models these days are scraping effectively the entirety of the internet, all books, etc., that might have been published that are in the public domain, some which may not be in the public domain, and it picks up on those patterns. So any biases that are present in the data are also going to be present in the model. And it's not easy to pick out and choose what those biases might be, or those perspectives might be. Consistency is also a huge issue because generative AI creates content based on probabilities, not fixed rules. And that means that its output can vary each time. And that reliability is required for tasks that need stable and repeatable results, like grading. And on the explainability front, these processes are quite complex. They often have millions of parameters that are adjusted through training. Like ChatGPT 4.0, for example, has 1.8 trillion parameters. When you have so many parameters, the way these interact are not easily interpretable, and trying to work out why a certain thing has happened or certain output has occurred is effectively impossible. And this sort of is very difficult to use in high stakes environments such as grading. Now, what's classification AI on the other hand? Classification AI is basically a super smart organizer. It learns to categorize things into different groups based on the features. So, for example, in this kind of toy example, you can look at different animals and learn to identify whether they're cats or dogs by specifying different traits like fur length, ear shape, or sound. And once trained, you can quickly and accurately identify those and classify new items that it hasn't seen before into those existing groups. Now, how does this affect those issues that I talked about earlier? Well, on the consistency front, these AI systems are designed for consistency because they follow much clearer rules when they're sorting things into categories. They're trained on labeled data, and you can look at that labeling of that data in a much more transparent way that can reduce the bias effects that I can talk about later too. Now, not all classification systems are based on neural networks. There are lots of other types of systems too that have much more similar rule sets, much clearer rule sets that you can use to understand what things are happening. On the bias front, if you use large data sets, yes, there can be issues with bias, but at the end of the day, you can still go in and you can diagnose the raw data sets and work out what's happening under the hood. You can't really do that in generative AI because it's just taking a large corpus of text and processing that. And on the explainability front, depending on how you build those models, you can segment different components of classification and create results based on combinations of different outputs of different classification models to have a much higher explainability. So even these tools can show you how you're going to be able to make that whole process much more transparent, which is much more appropriate for things like grading. Now, real question is, why should you take my word for it? The things I've actually drawn out here aren't really based on theoretical musings. They're rooted in substantial research. Studies have shown that generative AI models like ChatGPT, for example, are facing critical issues that make them unsuitable for grading. So I'm going to actually dive into some academic papers that actually look into this. Now, generally speaking, I'm not much for having many words on a slide, but given the nature of these papers, I think it's sort of appropriate. But I'll walk through these. So the first paper is by War, Melissa, and Oster, and they effectively looked at marking identical written samples with specific variations in student descriptions, such as race, socioeconomic status, and school type. And they found some really interesting components. They found that just by emphasizing class and or school type, there was a significant difference in the output of the grade. The same thing happened and the impact of the socioeconomic status as well. And lastly, the order of the particular prompts and information mattered, which is not useful at all when it comes to those consistency points. So immediately we have issues of bias that are occurring because of the underlying data in those sets, but also because of the reliability issue with regards to order, we're having order effects as well. In another paper by Floden, they actually marked over 1,300 papers, right? And they marked them with human markers, and they also marked them with ChatGPT to try to look at the differences and the issues here. Now, they found immediately low accuracy. Only 29% of the exams received the exact same mark from both the ChatGPT and human markers. So it really highlights the differences in how those systems can work. But I think what's really quite interesting are the latter two, which is the fact that the representative distribution of those grades was not appropriately distributed compared to the human markers. So the work that's actually coming out of this isn't even reflecting human output in its overall distribution rather than like the specific distribution. And the last part is the lack of replicability. In their study, they had to intentionally add in a methodology where they would average out over 3 different attempts from the ChatGPT grading. And they only found that 40 to 45% of the exams, 40 to 40% of the exams received different grades every time they put in the same thing. You cannot have a system with low consistency issues like this. So, in my opinion, these sorts of issues are really quite paramount, and we can try to solve these things too, right? So, one of the big things that wasn't mentioned in those papers was the lack of explainability. So unlike human markers or classification models, the generative models tend to be black boxes, and they operate in kind of a tangled web of probabilistic predictions. So there's no clear rationale as to what happens why. Especially even if you ask them why they gave a certain grade, uh, that reasoning is not necessarily appropriate. And there was a Cambridge study actually that looked into this by Brady and Hughes in 2024. The model itself has no internal reasoning that it can be pulled out of when you ask it what is going on under the hood. Now, in my opinion, classification AI is the solution because these types of systems can be custom built for grading, where consistency and transparency and fairness actually are really important. In my opinion, they're non-negotiable. So the really big thing here is that unlike generative AI, those classification models are trained on data that is labeled appropriate to the task, and you can create systems with well-defined features, and that results in a much more consistent and transparent outcome. So that is my sorry, yeah. So that's my opinion there. What my recommendations? I think generally speaking, I recommend that you adopt classification AI for high stakes grading. You can use generative for maybe some low stakes grading. You really need to have a system of human oversight and accountability when it comes to these systems, because you really need to have a human in the loop in this approach. And lastly, we need to invest in teacher and student training because these systems are rapidly evolving and we need to completely stay on top of these things. So I hope you liked my little introduction there. We're going to now move on to the roundtable. So I'd like to introduce our guests.
Hello.
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
So our guests today are James Love. So James Love is the Chief Product Officer at Appdem. He leads the vision, strategy, and execution of innovative, scalable cloud-based technologies that empower education and employability providers to deliver better outcomes. So he has 15 years of experience in launching and growing and maintaining market-leading SaaS products for global scale. And I can't wait to hear his thoughts on this. We've also got Pat Coates. Pat's worked in the e-assessment for over 25 years, seeing lots of different technologies evolve over lots of different times. He's been working in e-testing, e-marking, and e-portfolio, and currently he is the CEO of the e-assessment association. And his current focus is to really extend the range of services that the EAA has available to educate everybody. And Tim Burnett is the founder of the Test Community Network. Tim has a long list of things that he does. He's a speaker, podcaster, teacher, and marketing consultant. And currently, you can follow him on LinkedIn as he kind of explores all the different practices in digital assessment and all the different tools and resources that are available there. Thank you, everybody. So let's jump straight into the questions. James, Appdem is the UK's leading apprenticeship platform. And you're heavily investing into artificial intelligence, right, to help people throughout the apprenticeship lifecycle. So, can you tell us a little bit about what you've released so far, what you're working on, and why you've chosen either generative or classification AI for the systems for each component?
Sure. We started out around May or so of last year, so you could argue a little bit behind the curve as a lot of the generative AI debate was going forwards, but with a vision of transforming regulated vocational training, particularly. taking into account the technology that was coming to light and wanting very much to combine that with the human expertise that is at the forefront of particularly apprenticeship delivery, but vocational delivery in general, ultimately to lead to better quality outcomes and improved efficiency for an industry which frankly has to do quite a lot with not very much money. And now that's the case in education in general, but certainly I am biased because I work in the regulated vocational space. So they are, of course, met with challenges on funding. So we wanted to find anything that we could do that was going to improve that learner experience, but also drive efficiencies for organizations. Our first foray was actually into a solution to provide an objective measure of how a learner was traveling in terms of their learning and their training that they were doing, because hitherto it largely had been subjective. The learner would grade themselves, and I mean grade outside of the context of grading an assignment, but sort of measure where they're up to. And the tutor would also make that sort of subjective opinion based on potentially some questions that had been asked or a review that took place. So that introduced its very own bias, its real world bias, never mind a technology bias. So we introduced a solution which selected using generative AI very deliberately because we wanted it to be adaptive. We wanted it to have that variability, that very same variability that you don't want when it comes to grading. We needed that and wanted that when it came to assessing where a learner was up to, by generating really short multiple choice question assessments that we very deliberately position not as assessments but as a learning tool, because it guides the learner as they're running through, thus sort of shortening that feedback loop where it's really critical for that learner to get feedback on the question and the answer that they've got as quickly as possible to support their ongoing learning, rather than having to wait for the next time they get FaceTime with their tutor. We launched that to market actually October of last year, went through our early adopter process and made improvements, iterations to the product. And we've continued to do that through the course of this year, it now being generally available and also expanding out into an ability to not only check knowledge, and within apprenticeships, that's known as knowledge, skills, and behaviours. There's sort of a classification of what you need to know to succeed at your apprenticeship. We also expanded that out to deal with situational judgment, where it will look at a given scenario. The learner will be presented with a scenario that they might encounter at work, and check and see how they'd respond to that and whether that would be the right approach, give them feedback and guidance. Again, generative AI there being really important because we need the variability, because your input is changing so regularly and the actual output that you need needs to be within context of what you're doing. Our next solution that we're working on at the minute, but we launched earlier this year, was our virtual assistant for learners. And this largely came about, again, choosing to use generative AI because we needed it to be personalized. We needed it to be conversational. It couldn't have the same input output every time. And it was by design not built that way. But it was partly done because of the rise and frankly almost ubiquity of generative AI tools available to our learners and our tutors already. ChatGPT, you've got My AI in Snapchat. You've got all sorts of tools out there, and people were using them anyway. And that presents a challenge because you're absolutely correct that the inherent biases and socioeconomic influences, and also critically the a huge volume of data that it has available to it. How do you drive specificity to what that learner actually needs to know? Well, you can't when it's outside of the system of record, but within that system of record, we can provide that critical context that allows for it to provide really informative and formative feedback and guidance to that learner as to where they need to go next. That being said, we're not ignoring classification AI, and I'm very pleased to say that I'm here with Grade today because we knew that we needed to solve a problem in the marking space as well. It's a real challenge within the vocational learning space. A lot of time spent, up to 50% or more of a tutor's time is spent marking assignments. And generative AI is not right for that. It's good for a lot of things. So I'm very pleased to say that we've partnered with Grade in order to take advantage of the heritage that you guys have built and all of the effort you've put into building your classification AI models around marking in general and grading. And that's set to launch later this year, fully embedded within the context of Aptum. So we don't discount generative AI or classification AI, but we're very deliberately taking that more that more intimate approach with our engagement with learners, and that's why we've chosen to use generative AI, also wanting to make sure it remains secure, remains auditable, and remains trackable within the context of our system. So it's not happening somewhere else. You can keep hold of that whole learner experience. I hope that helps.
No, absolutely, absolutely. And it really kind of highlights that thing that I said earlier. When you're using technology to solve a problem, you've got to work out what degree of variability and risk that you're able to handle for those particular systems, and then make the decision that's appropriate using leveraging the
Absolutely.
benefits of that particular type of technology. Thanks for that, James. And also, everybody in the audience, please do put your questions in the chat. We will also be taking general questions from the chat as well. Pat, you've been in the industry for 25 years. Can you tell us what you've seen evolve from sort of the pre-AI, the classification, and now the generative?
I can have a go. I'll start off by saying I'm not a data scientist. I'm a layperson, so sometimes the language that I use might not make sense to an expert. But I've tried to explain this to myself, in all honesty, around. And there's two elements of AI and how it can be used. One is the developing the assessments in the first place, and then the other part of it is marking the assessments, whatever format they are. And I think the initial focus was always on the making the generation of assessments a lot better. So you started off with templated item generation. So, the cat sat on the mat, we place a noun, and it could be the mouse sat on the mat or the whatever. So it was very much templated. It is machine learning. You're just taking it through a process. And I think classification AI was more the sort of the what I would call the custom AI. So you're writing a model to perform a particular task. I used to work with ACT. They had an essay that they used to mark. It was only marked out of 6, and they actually trained AI models to mark that, and it was very, very good at that. Just as accurate / inaccurate as human graders. And I think that's something I just want to say here. I know AI is biased, but just to be clear, people are biased as well. So it's all very easy we always assume that the way we do things at the moment is perfect and the benchmark of excellence. And that's not the case. There are lots of issues and challenges around it. Do you want the essay? And my mother was a teacher, by the way, that was marked at 2 o'clock in the morning after half a bottle of wine. Well, so actually, people are variables. My mother will hate me for having said that, but then she'll never listen to this, so it's okay. And I think the other thing is that now with generative AI, the big thing is that it wasn't just, inverted commas, how clever it was the affordability and the fact that it could make anyone can use it, have access to it. I mean, it's costing, pennies to do things that historically might have cost tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars to do. And the amount of data that these models are being trained on, like you said before, Manjinder, it's everything on the internet basically, and they're running out of things to train the models. They're now getting AI to write models to train. So that's on the content creation side. And I worked with a company Rid Labs a few years ago who do more the classification. I work with Certiverse now, we're using AI to write items. Fantastic. Now, in terms of the marking side of things, I think that again is something that's got huge opportunity because there's so many. I guess it's the biggest pain point of examinations, the fact that you have to have everyone marking the exams. Having said that, I think the challenge is we do have this obsession still that everyone has to take the same exam at the same time. And I think that is one of the biggest challenges we face. And actually, if all we're doing is trying to fix a problem that we could actually easily solve by having exams spread over, well, if you can actually get AI to write exams, why can you not have 10 different versions of the exams and everyone takes a different version of the exam, whatever, at a different time? Because then you don't have this problem of everyone having to try and mark. So yes, AI can make it better. The challenge of using AI is you've got to have some way of getting the content into the system for the AI to mark. And I think that's another one of the challenges as well. So if you can perhaps get to a situation where students have the option of taking multiple exams, whether it'll be test on demand or over a window, that's going to reduce the pressure in terms of having devices for students to type on. Secondly, assuming they can type, because we've got to be careful in making this assumption that people can type because we're all about fairness. Having said that, my handwriting's atrocious, and I was always disadvantaged because my handwriting was atrocious. No one cared about that. But actually, if you say you have to now type and people haven't got the typing skills or the manual dexterity to be able to, you've got to be there for that. So I think that AI has a huge opportunity, whether it's classification or generative. I don't think anyone will care. All they care about is the outcome of how accurate is it. But then I think we also need to look at how we can have multiple versions of the exam to take that pressure off. Why should we need 600,000 computers because everyone has to take GCSE English at the same time? Well, actually, they don't, because we've got 3 awarding organisations all delivering English exams who'd have 3 different versions. So why not have 30 different versions? So anyway, I shall stop there. But just to say, I'm a huge advocate of AI. It is the way forward. We can't put the genie back in the bottle. It's just a question of making sure we do it, like you say, in a fashion that making sure that we minimise bias and it meets the objectives and benefits the learners at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think Pat, what you said there is really paramount. You know, it just because this is a tool we have access to doesn't necessarily mean it is the solution that is, for this tool. There are lots of other technology-based solutions or process orientation-based solutions for those types of problems too. Certainly. Tim, so a question for you really is, in your experience with the test community network, what are people saying with regards to this shift in technology?
Yeah, it's interesting. So obviously, it's been it's been the big conversation, hasn't it? And as kind of Pat talked about, yeah, the embracing the technology, understanding some of the challenges, kind of going through the processes of what are the weaknesses and strengths of this particular item. I think generally people are still trying to figure it out. There's little pockets of activity going on, but yeah, people are still asking lots of questions. I was listening to a podcast this morning where the EdTech podcast, where I was looking, it was a big leader in the use of AI in education, and they're still having those conversations about trust and education and AI literacy. They're kind of big points of it. I'm just going to share my screen if that's all right, and I'm just going to kind of walk you through just some of the kind of, just give you a kind of brief insight really to what's going on. This is Test Community Network. And on here you can see kind of lots of events going on around the community in terms of in the education space. But the conversation, I've just done a search in AI, and there's so many conversations going on around the topic of just a whole, really kind of looking at the formative angle of it as opposed to the summative. And I think when you look at the products and services that are out there that are using AI, it's definitely seeing a lot more traction within the formative space than it is in the high stakes space. I think people are still kind of a little bit concerned, a bit worried about using it for high stakes summative assessment, to the point where I think you're seeing organizations who I've heard this on a number of occasions now, where they've got AI embedded, certainly in terms of the high stakes platforms. They're actually saying, "Can you switch that off? We're not quite ready for that yet." And I think certainly in the area of marking and making decisions, people are very nervous. People are still quite nervous about copyright. I don't know. Yes, there should be, and there's some big questions about that as well. But there's still some. It's still kind of an area where we've got a lot of learning to go, a lot of new things to kind of explore and discover, and we're just not quite yet at the phase where we're fully embraced in it yet. But I'm with Pat. I think it's fascinating. I think there's a full opportunity to that whole personalization aspect, get rid of these traditional assessments that we've had for a long time, and let's really turn the assessment cycle on its head. That's what a lot of people are kind of asking those questions. Whether or not we're ready for that yet, I don't know.
Yeah, it's a good point, right? Because in some sense, to do an AI transformation, you need to be at least on the journey of doing a digital transformation. And there are lots of areas where that isn't actually happening yet. Right. So with that, we're going to move to questions from the chat. So if you haven't already, please do add them. And then we'll be picking them and showing them on the screen. So while we're waiting for some of those, let's look at some questions that we already have. So, there we go. So we got a question from John Erland. How worried should we be about plagiarism/copyright? Pat, do you want to start off taking this one?
Yeah, I think there's two parts that it's very difficult with the copyright component, because I know particularly in the sort of the certification market, people do copyright their questions. So that my argument to that is create so many questions, because if something's like computer generated, you can't copyright it basically. If you have a person check it, technically you could, but I think just create a lot of content and it's not an issue. would be my argument about that one. Don't bother copyrighting your content because they just have loads of it, so it doesn't matter, so no one can use and abuse it. Plagiarism, a bit more difficult. There is software out there that will detect plagiarism. Equally, there's as many applications of the product saying, and please make it written so that it can bypass any anti-plagiarism software, etc. So no matter how good you are at finding means of sort of stopping this, there's as much technology to prevent it. I think probably in the most sort of basic sense of the word, that the key to it is if you are running exams and run them in controlled conditions so that people cannot access the internet, lockdown browser if they're doing it via caption, etc. Making it so that they can't do that, whether it's online proctored or it's a physical location. So I think those physical checks of integrity are still going to be there. I know there is also work being done, how good it is around trying to predict if people are cheating, how quickly they respond, etc. So how they create it. But like I said, but for every opportunity there is to sort of stop that, there's always going to be someone that's got an alternative. So I think we're not going to get away from anyone just taking an exam at home without any sort of controls in place. But so that would be from my perspective. If you can control the exam conditions, it minimises the opportunity. If someone's submitting an essay they've written at home, etc., that becomes much, much more difficult. So perhaps it's still appropriate for formative assessment, but less so for summative assessment.
Yeah. We've got another question here from Goen. Can you give examples of what kind of assessments can be graded and which not? We'll actually be doing a demo slightly later of grade and what the types of assessments that can be graded using artificial intelligence. But the short answer is we can handle maths, short text, and essay questions. We've got a good question here from Paul. Are exam boards, etc., really ready to move away from traditional summative assessment? James, you do with a lot of kind of awarding organizations as well with the apprenticeship work. Do you want to answer that?
Yeah, I could answer that in one word: no. And that's a shame. It generally is, but I think this goes beyond just exam boards at this point. The industry is not ready. I mean, we just heard Pat talk about plagiarism. What are you testing? We need to get away from the concept of testing pure knowledge and learnt by rote, because that isn't real. The real world, generative AI is here. AI is here. Google was here a while ago. Email was here before that. We've had all of these transformations over time, and the initial reaction to them, on the whole, is fear. We couldn't possibly change. We couldn't possibly do anything differently. I certainly remember from my own personal reflections of having to learn books by heart and then write about them in an exam. Why? Why was that ever going to be useful to me in my future? Whereas the reality is, you get into the working world, and commercial organizations are looking for every advantage they can get. So if they can get someone who is very good at using generative AI or ChatGPT to do their job, why don't we focus in on that? So I don't think they're going to be moving away from summative assessments anytime soon, because I don't think they're ready for it. But unfortunately, education is one of those industries that is allowed to lay behind the times for longer, but it needs to accelerate in its ability to adapt and grow and actually start a different approach to education. Now, again, I'm super biased because vocational learning, I mean, it's grown a lot really over the course of the last 20 years. It used to have, and still in some cases does have, a bias from other people of, well, that's what you do if you don't have brains, which is not fair at all. It's just a different way of learning. It's a practical way of learning versus a more traditional academic way of learning. So there are shifts and changes, but it's going to take probably too long. And what we really need is the industry at large to get frustrated with that in order to enact change.
Actually, if I
They're
can
not
add
going to do it on their own.
Oh, sorry. If I can add something to that, I know that we have Ofqual, who are the regulators for the assessment market. They're sort of committed to technology-enabled assessment in its borders, but then they also equally aren't, because what you're trying to do, I get there has to be regulation, but you take an organisation that's government run, that's slow, that's paranoid about what the Daily Mail is going to say rather than actually what's best for the students. I making decisions, and it's just going to be very, very slow. And I think that sometimes what happens is you end up with something where we're not quite sure, so we'll just sit on the fence, and then organisations can't make the commitment, and because they can't make the commitment, they're then in a position, oh, we won't invest because we can't afford to waste the money, etc. So I think I mean, I know the DFE are doing a consultation. I can forget how many consultations there will be and how many times we'll go. It's good they're doing it, but I suspect by the 6 to 12 months it takes to come out with some findings, the world will have moved on so much that it's not relevant. It's really, really difficult and challenging for anyone to regulate in this market. I know recently in California we were talking about it. I think the EU, in terms of the AI Act, has sort of got it right. I know they're talking about fines and that sort of thing. Whether that will ever happen or not, but at least there's a penalty there. But putting the degrees of risk, and I would put assessment at high risk because you're impacting on people's careers, their life. So there's a huge impact. Like I said before, with ACT, when they had the essay marking component that they could score really accurately, the reason they didn't do it was because of potential PR. Oh, you've got a computer writing the exam. Oh, no, whatever. We don't want that. So they carried on with human graders. They used it for formative, even though it was actually potentially more accurate than the human graders because they thought we just want to manage the PR. So that's always going to be the problem. And I think, unfortunately, in this country, we've got to a situation where, do you know what, things aren't perfect with the way we're doing at the moment. I could give examples of awarding organisations that, lose candidate scripts, lose coursework, lose material, things don't yet. But that's all right because that happens now. But if there's anything that goes wrong with a computer-based test or an email, oh, that's shocking, that's outrageous, how awful that is. So I think you need to be a bit pragmatic about this and accept that things aren't perfect. You have to pilot, you have to go through a process. But as long as your goal at the end is to benefit the student and to do things better, then I think it has to be actively encouraged, but not doing it because that's not the way we do it or because perceived issues about, oh, it's dumbing down, etc. is just the wrong way of looking at it.
So we've got a question here from Fiona. To what extent does classification AI fully mitigate those three issues with Gen AI? And how much are they still an issue with classification AI? Yeah, that's a really good question too. So the three issues, just to bring them back up, were bias. I'm trying to bring them up. Consistency and explainability. Yeah, so bias, consistency, and explainability. Now, I don't want to say that classification AI is like the silver bullet because it has to be done appropriately, right? So on the point of bias, all systems are biased to the extent that their underlying data is biased. And the reason classification AI systems are easier to handle is because they're based on labeled data. So a human being can go in and they can examine the labels and then they can extract out any biases that may or may not have existed, or you can do statistical analysis to work out any biases that may be existing with any kind of metadata that might be existing. You can remove those biases and then train your data on, sorry, and then train your models on that data, and that allows you to deal with bias in a much more systematic way, which you can't do with Gen AI. On the point of consistency, these models are sorry, we've got another question, but we'll come back to that in a second. But on the point of consistency, these models are algorithmic. They're not predictive. So what I mean by that is the same input creates the same output, which we've shown is not what happens with generative AI. So they are at least internally consistent, which is really important. And on the point of explainability, yes, neural networks can be quite difficult to get explainability from, but neural networks aren't the only different types of AI. And even if you do use neural networks, you can use sub-models that look at different features that you are actually looking for within your data sets, and then you can create outcomes based on the results of those sub-models and still be able to create that systematic way of looking at why things are happening. And that's how classification is particularly different from generative. It doesn't immediately solve those issues, but there are systems in place. Whereas in generative, it's effectively impossible by its very architecture. So was the question we just had? Sorry. So what could be the directions in which classification AI? Sorry. What could be directions in classification AI so that it can be more accepted? I guess it's more for Tim, right? You've got your finger on the pulse of all AI tools effectively on the market right now, right? So, yeah.
Sorry, yeah, yeah. To be honest, there are lots of different models and types out there, and they all bring together kind of different angles and opportunities. I must admit, classification and the kind of that structure, it's the one that I'm a little bit less familiar with, and I kind of want to kind of learn a bit more about. The ones where I've seen kind of real impact and potential are things where you've got domain specific knowledge tools. So yeah, that kind of RAG, the retrieval augmented generation models, where you can actually train up the models themselves based on a large set of data. When it comes to the kind of marking side of things, as you've said with the generative AI, you've still got those probabilities of change, because if you're relying on the large language model, there's going to be variance in there. And I think it's great for doing some formative tasks. I've done, it's interesting. James was saying about the products that you've come out with for the apprentices. I teach apprentices, so I've been creating my own little apps in class to mark and help and guide the students' work. And you need that knowledge to sit alongside. You need to augment it with some specialist knowledge, because the general stuff just isn't there. But the opportunity for it to get it wrong, I've seen it. I asked it to do like a little chat exercise where after the chat, give them a grade at the end of it, and it got it completely wrong in a couple of cases. It was absolutely fine, but you've I think for formative, this is where we're still experimenting, and that's where we've got some room for maneuver. And I think, like Pat said, as soon as we put these things out there into that high stakes space and get it wrong, that's when we're really going to suffer. So there's lots of different tools out there. It's about us plugging those together and working in a way that work properly for the task that you're trying to do and the risk measures that you're trying to accommodate.
I think if I could add to that, I'd reframe the thought behind the question. Rather than what could be the direction that classification AI could take, is what direction can we as humans take? Because we need to become more resilient. There's a huge amount of fear and lack of trust around technology in general. There always has been. This is not new, and it's been going on for hundreds of years. We're getting better at it, but there's this constant fear that AI is going to take over the world. AI is going to, we're not going to end up in some sort of Terminator scenario, but AI is going to take my job. AI is going to fundamentally change things. Well, the last statement is true. AI is going to fundamentally change things, but that doesn't mean that it takes your job. We have to be more resilient and understand that it actually can do some things a lot better than we can, and that's okay. Stop wasting your time trying to do something that something else is better at it than you. It's a natural fear response, and it's all well and good for me to sit here and say we need to change our attitudes, but fundamentally, until the attitude changes, it doesn't really matter what direction any of this technology takes.
Definitely. Do we have any more questions from the chat? Great. That one is so long that it doesn't actually have the preview, so I'm gonna have to find it in the chat. Apologies.
I saw the one came up asking about from Margaret, was it about
here it is. Yep. So why do you think that the adoption of e-assessments and with it AI enhanced grading is so slow in the UK, particularly in relation to high stakes national exams? ETS/Pearson and other testing providers have been using artificial intelligence enhanced marking for a long time now. It seems we are playing catch up in the UK. What reasons might there be for this?
Is it so on that one? The ETS and Pearson ones, they're based on supervised models, aren't they? Where they've been pre-trained on data.
That's
And
right.
I think when you look at it, let's say GCSEs, that question is the first time it's gone out into the space. You don't have the data to train your model on. Obviously, there's an opportunity. I think this is where we see things where AI can start to augment that process, where it can start to mark the first, you have human markers mark the first 10% of the responses that are coming through, so it starts to train the model for that particular question. But you've got a short period of time where those exams have been submitted, and that the results have to go out, and it's going to take some some guts for someone to kind of implement that, and with the hope that it's going to work. I think they should do it, but
Do you know what?
yeah,
I'm kind of had it. Why do we have to wait for students to write essays? We've got this thing called generative AI that can write 1,000 essays. Not saying that could be human graded, that could have every permutation. Let's face it, it's not going to be asking a question about, Henry VIII. There's only like 5 different questions you can add on. But you can actually do that, train the models before the exam is
yeah,
released.
yeah.
So that then when the exam's submitted, either it's submitted in electronic format because it's been typed, or it's been scanned and then digitized, which I think is another thing about using AI to be able to improve that. Can it be marked instantly? I'm not saying you're going to get your grades back immediately for that. I know that the UK organisations, the AQA and Excel, Pearson qualifications, Cambridge examinations, and AQA are all doing work. I think internationally, where there isn't the same regulation, I'm not saying there's not rigor in their approach, but IGCSE is about being delivered. I know the International Baccalaureate are doing exams electronically. I know there's a lot of work going on. I think to the point before, it's, political influence. I think partly about nervousness about, if we change things, is everyone going to say we're dumbing it down? If something goes wrong, and you know what, things do go wrong, and then everyone's going to sort of start moaning and get sort of vilified in the press. So you have to go through that process. But also, do you know what? It's easier to come up with an excuse not to do something. I've worked overseas as well, with assessments, and guess what? You just run perpetual pilots because you tick a box to say you're doing something. It doesn't mean it's not, and actually you just don't have to make any too many decisions or do difficult decisions or it's a lot of hassle. Let's just not bother. And unfortunately, back to the point, humans are biased. They don't want to do it. I mean, wouldn't it be fantastic if we could change the whole structure of exams altogether? Why do we have to have this whole UCAS and clearing? Why don't we just have our A levels? You get the results immediately, and you apply based on your actual results. Is it good enough to do that? For example, if I've got an A star, does it matter if I've got 98% or 94% if I've got an A star? And that's always a thing, by the way, with the essay marking automatically. It's those grade boundaries of, is it just an A or is it a B minus sort of thing? That is always the most challenging part.
But that's where the human in the loop comes in, right?
Yeah.
Because AI can and probably only should go so far. And I'm sure we'll get to, as mentioned, you start talking about grade and the way that works. But I mean, it brings the human in the loop at the start, and that's the way it learns, right? And I think that's incredibly powerful. But I think again, I'm sounding like some kind of political activist here. I don't mean it this way, but I think in the UK we have a challenge which comes back to 3 main things. Money is an obvious one. People are making money out of grading things at the minute, and they don't want their job taken away. I've already talked about that. Institutionalization. We are absolutely pre-trained that this is the way it must be done. This is the way that learning must be done. And then finally, we have pedigree. So the UK and there are plenty of other countries in the world, but we're known for having really good education. People come to us internationally to be educated. And that makes it really hard to shift away from the current paradigm because we don't want to risk any of those things.
I think just on that last point, I think unless we take some bolder steps, we are going to slip further behind on that curve, and people will realise that actually we're not at the cutting edge. Just to your point, Pat, I mean, definitely there's a question about whether or not we should be using these exam structures and models. And I'm kind of at the view that when you come to GCSE level, it's a diagnostic based exercise because you stay in education anyway. So that would be a better model to give you more powers. I think the other thing to think about is just flipping the whole process in its entirety. At the moment, we're talking about SMEs and people like that and markers being involved downstream. Why they're not at the start of the stream, why they're not training these models in the first place, have a national model for a subject. That's where we could really take some potential and go beyond. So I think it's all to play for at the moment.
Just to add to that, though, you give the same essay to 2 human graders, you're not going to get exactly the same mark again and again. So back to the point, we have this paradigm of humans are perfect. That's not the situation. That's why we have double marking, 3 marking, why you have moderate, because it's not true. It just doesn't exist. So it's a level of perfection we've not got that. I had this conversation with a chief psychometrician the other day when I said he was talking about item writing, and he said they're really good, the quality. It was using agentic AI, etc., to write items. I said, well, that's fantastic. I said, how good are people at writing items? I said, well, what do you mean? So if I ask a human to write those items, are they going to get 100% perfection, or are they also going to be 85, 90%, which is a sort of levels? And actually said, well, that's a really good point, and I don't know. So actually, and I suspect that the answer will be they're also 85, 90% accurate in terms of, so people aren't perfect either. So I think we've just got to bear that in mind. And also, I've traveled all over the world. I've yet to come across any country in the world that says we've got so many markers, we don't know what to do with them, and it's really easy task. It's really difficult. You talk about bias. Give me the profile of the average marker of GCSEs and A levels, and we'll talk about bias then, because I think you'll find they might fit a certain characteristic. So that's bias in itself. So
Yeah. And in some sense, it presents an opportunity, right? Because if you add the gearing effect of technology in these systems, you can actually remove that systematic bias within the population of the people who might be doing that marking. So thank you very much, gentlemen, for this roundtable. And I'm going to jump into the demo section of the webinar.
actually, just while you're doing that, Majid, I just want to think. We ran the EAA ran an AI special interest group, and it was on e-marking, and the number of people that were interested in it was a multiple of any other special interest group got. So this is an area that's hugely interesting for a lot of people. So it's great that you're doing this sort of thing, and hopefully there'll be more opportunities to engage about the work that you're doing in other organisations as well, of course.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you everybody for joining us. I'm just going to switch over now. So we've talked a lot about kind of classification AI-based marking. So with that in mind, let's actually show you a couple of examples. So this question here is a short answer text question that's looking at the theory of evolution. What I've done here is I've built a rubric already. We don't necessarily need to worry specifically about how I'm marking things, but I'm caring about particular phrases that might have been added or lack thereof, and I can just highlight the relevant phrases within the work, tag them, and this is the system that would be effectively being labeling the data, because we're labeling the data while we're marking it, and we can label the lack of information as well. And if we mark this as done and move on to the next one, we can actually see an example where an AI suggestion has come in. This is highlighted to us by the system itself, so it's already very transparent. But on top of that, we have a confidence level. So this confidence level is a way for you to use your own insight and to be able to have yourself in the loop all the time, because you can either accept this suggestion or you can reject it. And that allows you to work with the system to be able to actually mark work much faster. You can see here this is done with a very small amount of data. There's been no pre-training here, just 7 or so scripts that were marked. We can do a very similar thing with mathematics. So here's a question on differentiation, and I care a lot, for example, about simplification before any work is done, getting the correct answer in a particular form, and then I might care, for whatever reason, about the form of the final answer. We don't have to necessarily, but what's quite useful here is that the system can actually learn that caring about particular things and not caring about particular things. So when suggestions are made, it can actually pick up that. So it's picked up the simplification here, it's also picked up the final answer. And again, it's highlighting to me and it's showing me how confident it is. In this case, because it's only seen a couple, that confidence level is low, but over time that confidence level will increase. And then finally, we've got an essay question here. So we can see that we can highlight and actually tag the relevant text within the essay itself. But after marking a handful of these, this case it's a little bit more. So if I go to the next one, sorry. So say we marked around 20 or so of these, the AI model has actually learnt from those particular ones and started suggesting feedback here as well. So here's an example of a classification system being able to mark short text, maths, and essay questions, and being able to do it very quickly. So that's a nice short demo. If you're interested, we'll be in touch so that you can have a more detailed demo. But thank you very much for joining us today, and we hope that you've enjoyed this. We'll be creating a report with all the findings from the scientific paper, and we'll be distributing that as well on top of everything. So thank you very much, everyone.